talking about kind of all the bad stuff and yucky stuff. So this week I thought we would talk about friends and how they help us get through life and make things a little bit easier. So I went ahead and used my distress medium and started putting down my background. I wanted to utilize some words, but I wanted them to be kind of subtle. So what I did was go ahead and just adhere them to the pages and then trim them around the edges so that it would fit my page. And I just trimmed them and made sure that everything kind of worked with the pages, and then I repeated that process on the other side and got that done. Then I started covering it with my background colors. I'm using distress paint, which dries permanent, and it also creates a non-porous surface, which is really good for covering up the words, but it's also a little translucent so you can see the words through it. So I went ahead and did that with all three of my colors of the distress paint that I used. You can use any acrylic paint if you want it to be more translucent. You can just simply add some water. I did end up using a baby wipe to spread it on to kind of thin it out a little bit more, but if you do that, make sure your baby wipe isn't too wet. And then I took some gesso, some white gesso, and went back over it. It was still a little bright for what I wanted, so I went back over it with some white gesso and I mixed it a little bit with water to thin it so that it would be more translucent than solid white. And I did that on both of the pages and got that nice and smoothed over so that it kind of blurred out the words but left a little bit of the color on the page. And so once I got all of my gesso done and it was dry, I re-added with my baby wipe my colors again. So I ended up with 2 layers of color and a layer of gesso, and it turned out really nice. You can still see the words on the back of the page that I originally added with the textured paper, but it's very, very subtle, which is what I was going for. So I just wanted it to be kind of showing through just a tad. So I did all that with the baby wipe, and then I used my brown distress ink and just kind of distressed it just a little bit more on the pages to kind of dull them out just a tad, but I didn't add too much, just enough to kind of distress it a little bit. And then once I did that, I started to create my border. I used my Pitt pen and created the border. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of some allergies today. And then I colored them in with my Pitt pen. And then colored them in with my white paint pen. So I went through and did that all the way around the border so that it kind of just stood out and framed my page. I really liked the way it turned out. So then, getting ready to add my elements, I went ahead and took some of these tags, and I took my brown distress ink and my colors that I used on my background, and I stamped a little bit of this cute little monkey stamp that I like, that's 2 little monkeys hugging, and then I cut them out. And don't worry about the detail, because I'm going to show you how I stamped that on the page to get the extra details in there so that it will show up like their legs and the little parts of the balloons and things like that. So what I do is I stamp it on the page first, and I used my art board to get a solid surface so I could get a good stamp on the page. And then I took the elements that I cut out and just added them on top of that with my matte medium and painted over it. I used some distress glaze over the ink because that distress ink does not dry permanent, and it's water-based, and you want to make sure it doesn't smear when you put the matte medium on it. So I did that on all my stuff, and then I started kind of just coloring in and doing some shading on each of the elements that are on the page. Just to kind of make them a little bit more lifelike. And you'll see in the close-up pictures that the shading really does make a difference. So I used my thin Pitt pens to do that. And then I did some shading on the balloons too. I just used a little bit of a darker color for each one to kind of shade it on the sides so that it kind of brought those elements out a little bit more. Then I took my white gel pen and added some highlights. I love to add highlights on the elements that I use so that it just kind of makes them pop a little bit more. So I lightened their eyes and did some little highlights around the edges and things like that. And then I took my brown Pitt pen and I did some shadowing around each of the elements so that it would kind of make them stand out a little bit more. Shadowing always helps. You can also shadow underneath before you put them down, if that makes it a little bit easier so you don't get brown on the elements that aren't supposed to be brown. I did it a little bit carefully so I didn't get it on the balloons. And then I went through and did some outlining. I was kind of having trouble with my pen, so I had to switch pens several times to get it to work. I'm not sure what's going on with my black pen, but it was kind of messed up. So anyway, I did some shading. And then I added my title. So once I went to add my title, I decided to use some solid black colors. The quote that I'm using is, friends make the great things better and the hard times easier. And so I wanted the great to stand out and friends to stand out, and I wanted easier to stand out. So I did those letters in my stamps and put them on the page. And then I took my label maker and I printed the rest of the quote out with my labels. They were sticky, so I stuck them down, peeled off the backs and stuck them down. And then I went over them with my matte medium to make sure they don't peel up later on over time, and dried them with my heat gun. And then I went around the edges and highlighted that with my brown pen, shadowed it in, and then I went around the edges again with my black Pitt pen, my thin one, and just kind of made those stand out a little bit more. And then I did some highlighting on the big black letters with my white gel pen just to make those stand out a little bit more. And that was the final result. So don't forget to date your page, because you want to make sure that you put a date on each of your pages. And that is the final product. So I hope you enjoyed it. Here's some close-ups so you can see it, and the shading that I did. And I hope you enjoyed it and got some inspiration. So you guys enjoy your week, and we'll see you next week.